Hi guys, welcome to the third lesson of anatomy and physiology. So today we are going to talk about the skeletal system, and this is lesson 3. But first we're going to break down the skeletal system in 2 days. So today we're going to talk about the overview of the skeletal system, and then we're also going to talk about the human skeletal system, such as the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton, and we're going to dive more deeper into that. And on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the bones, which is the bone types and the structures. And lastly, we're going to talk about the joints, which there's a lot of joints and the functions that they do. So we're going to talk about those number 3 and 4 on Wednesday. And today we're going to talk about the overview and the human skeletal system. So first, the overview. So humans possess what is called the endoskeleton, or internal skeleton. It develops from a mesenchyme cells of embryonic mesoderm, and the skeletal system is an organ system composed of bones, cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. The human skeleton is composed of over 200 bones of various shapes and sizes. I know you guys might think that skeleton is just like a very hard, simple bone that you just give to your dog, but actually it's very complex. And the bones are associated with blood vessels, nerves, and stem cells. And the stem cells are capable of producing a variety of body cells, so the human skeleton is effective at providing movement, protection, shape, and support for the human body. So muscles alone do not give the body the capacity for movement. You need the skeletal system to work along with the muscles in order to provide efficient movement. So the smallest fall could severely damage the brain and the internal organs if there were no skeletal system to protect them. And so enclosures made up of bones protect the brain and many internal organs. So because of the skeletal system, it is able to support the body in any position during any type of movement. So that is the overview, and let's go on to the human skeletal system. So the human skeletal system is divided into 2 anatomically distinct skeletal regions. Supporting the core of the body is called the axial skeleton, and it is composed of spine, rib cage, heel bone, and skull. The axial skeleton is the basis of much age-related pathology because it functions nonstop throughout life, and it balances and absorbs a large amount of the stress associated with lying down, moving, sitting, and standing. Now, attached laterally to the axial skeleton is called the appendicular skeleton. It is composed of the upper and lower appendages and the bones that connect them to the skeleton. The lower appendages include the bones of the feet, ankles, legs, kneecaps, and hips. Bones of the hands, wrists, arms, and shoulders comprise the upper appendages. The appendages take on the strains of movement and share some of the axial skeleton's work. Pathology mostly takes its toll on the joints of the appendages. So articulations connect each bone in the skeletal system directly to another bone. The articulations are areas where 2 bones meet to form a joint. Joints vary greatly in tissue composition and function, and we will describe the joint section in our next lesson, which is on Wednesday. So each bone has a characteristic surface features that result from its attachments to ligaments and tendons. Ligaments and tendons pull on the bone, forming a variety of protrusions and edges. And additional bone characteristics are formed when the bones meet at joints and where blood vessels and nerves come in contact with the bone. So let's talk more about the axial skeleton, which is, as we said, in the medial part of our body. So the axial skeleton is composed of all bones that are located along the vertical axis of the body. The skull is the superior most component of the axial skeleton. If you see right here, here. So the vertebral column is the medial most portion of the axial skeleton. This right here. And the ribs and the other bones making up the rib cage are considered part of the axial skeleton because they are functionally linked to the vertebral column. Now let's talk more in depth about the axial skeletons. So first, it's the skull, which is the superior most component of the axial skeleton. The skull is composed of several bones that come together in an embryo to form one functional structure called the cranium. Cranial bones protect the brain, ears, and the eyes from physical damage. Some of the cranial bones are attachment points for muscles that move the head, jaw, and neck. Muscles that produce facial features are also attached to the cranial bones. And many physicians divide the cranial bones into two categories, the calvaria and the cranial base. So the calvaria is the dome-shaped superior portion of the cranium. It is composed of frontal, occipital, and parietal bones, and the flat portion of the temporal bones. The cranial base is composed of two remaining cranial bones, which is the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone. Then now we have sutures. Believe it or not, in our skulls we have sutures that join each plate of our skull. So the posterior portion of the frontal bone is joined to the two parietal bones along a joint called the coronal suture. And the parietal bones form the sides of the roof of the cranium, and they are fused to each other medially at the sagittal suture. The two temporal bones located at the sides and the base of the skull. They are fused to the parietal bones by the squamosal suture. The temporal bones have a complex shape with several distinct anatomical features. The mastoid process, styloid process, tymphanic process, and the zygomatic process. Now moving on to the vertebral column, which is the medial part of the axial skeleton. So the vertebral column is a flexible column formed of a series of bones called the vertebrae, or the vertebrae. In humans, the vertebral column is composed of 5 distinct regions. The neck or the cervical region is composed of 7 cervical vertebrae. Making up the thoracic region are the 12 thoracic vertebrae. This region is articulated with the rib cage. In the lower back are 5 lumbar vertebrae. The sacral region is composed of 5 fused sacral vertebrae that articulate with hip bones of the appendicular skeleton. A series of 3 to 5 fused coxal vertebrae form the tail end of the vertebrae column. The number of vertebrae present in the region can vary from one individual to the next. However, the number of cervical vertebrae rarely varies. So a vertebrae in the 3 upper regions of the vertebral column are called true or movable vertebrae. The sacral and coccygeal vertebrae are called false or fixed vertebrae because they are fused to one another. So Okay, so typical vertebral bone is composed of the vertebral body, vertebral arch, and the vertebral foramen. And the vertebral body supports the weight of the body. And dorsal to the body is the vertebral arch, which is composed of a pair of pedicles, or four articular processes, two laterally projecting transverse processes, and a spinous process. These processes are important muscle attachment points that allow movement of the appendages, head, neck, and vertebral column, while the articular processes act to articulate the vertebrae with each other. The vertebral foramen is a passageway for the spinal cord, and it's continuous, and it is continuous with the foramen magnum of the occipital bone. Cervical vertebrae have a smaller body than the other vertebrae, but they also have a small transverse process and a short bifurcated spinous process. So cervical vertebrae differ from other vertebrae in that they have two transverse foramina that serve as passageways for major blood vessels into the skull. The first and second cervical vertebrae, the atlas and the axis, respectively, differ from the others because of their specialized jobs. The atlas supports the skull. It lacks a body but has a large articular surfaces that attach to the occipital bone. And below the atlas is the axis, upon which the atlas and head rotate. It is characterized by a large protrusion called the dens, or the dens. The dens articulate with the atlas to allow free movement of the skull. So the rib cage, or thorax. The thorax is composed of costal cartilage, ribs, and sternum. It is a protective structure that also assists with breathing. And the ribs are large arches of bone that articulate with the thoracic vertebrae and sternum. The 7 upper ribs called true ribs because they attach directly to the sternum, or the flexible costal cartilage. The 8th through 10th ribs are attached to the costal cartilage of the rib above, and they're called false ribs. The 2 bottom ribs are not attached to the costal cartilage and are given the term floating or vertebral ribs. So if you can see over here, we said that these are the true ribs because it attaches directly to the costal cartilage. These are the false ribs because they actually do not have, they're attached to the costal cartilage, not to the sternum. And over here, if you see the lines are pointing at these 2 bones, and they are not directly connected to the costal cartilage. They're just floating there. So that's where we got the name floating ribs. So next, let's go into the appendicular skeleton. So the appendicular skeleton contains the various bones that make up the extremities. The extremities are defined as the upper and lower limbs. The upper limbs, or superior extremities, are also known as the pectoral appendages, and they are attached to the rib cages by ligaments in a region called the shoulder, or a pectoral girdle. Bones of the lower limbs, or inferior extremities, are often referred to as pelvic appendages. They are fused to the sacrum in a region called the pelvic girdle. The pectoral girdle bones are lightweight and flexible compared with the pelvic girdle. The 2 primary functions of the pelvic girdle are to support the weight of the body and to maintain an upright position or posture. These jobs require thick bones and a rigid attachment to the body. Each of the upper extremities is made up of 2 shoulder bones, 3 arm bones, 8 wrist bones, and 19 hand bones. However, each lower extremity has 3 fused hip bones, 4 leg bones, 7 ankle bones, and 19 foot bones. So let's go more in depth to the appendicular skeleton. So first we have the clavicle and scapula. Forming the shoulder girdle are ventrally located clavicle and the dorsally located called scapula. The clavicle, or you guys are more commonly known as the collarbone, is a long curved bone that runs parallel to the first rib. Its medial end is attached to the sternum by ligaments. The lateral end is called the acromial extremity. It forms a complex joint with the scapula. Muscles of the arms, back, chest, and the neck attach to the clavicle. This is why broken clavicle severely restricts upper head and upper extremity movement. The scapula, or the shoulder blade, is a flat triangular bone with a blade-like medial surface that is parallel to the vertebral column. Its lateral end contains a glenoid cavity, which articulates with the humerus to form the shoulder joint. The scapula is a major attachment point for muscles that move the shoulders and arms. On the scapula's dorsal and lateral edges is the acromion process, a large carved outgrowth that articulates with the acromial extremity of the clavicle. Next, we have the 3 arm bones, which are humerus, radius, and ulna. Humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. Significant features of the humerus are tubercles located near the head and the deltoid turbicy in the lateral edge. They are important muscle attachments points for arm movement. On the distal portion of the humerus is a very specialized articular surface composed of 2 structures, the trochlea and the capitulum. Together with the radius and ulna, they form the elbow joint. Next, we have a double row of 8 articulated bones, which forms the carpal, or as we commonly known as the wrist. Articulated with the radius and the ulna is the proximal row of carpal bones. It is composed of the navicular, lunate, triangular, and pisiform bones. The navicular bone is immediately distal to the radius, and the lunate articulates with the ulna. A small hard bump, which can be felt at the base of the wrist under the pinky finger, is called the pisiform. Each metacarpal is attached to a series of bones called phalanges, which make up the finger bones. With the exception of the thumb, each finger has 3 phalanges, the proximal, the intermediate, and the distal. Now moving on to the leg bones. We have the leg bones, and they are made up of femur, tibia, fibula, and patella. The femur is the longest and the strongest bone in the body because it supports much of the body's standing weight. The proximal end of the femur is characterized by a large round head that projects into the acetabulum to form a ball and socket joint of the pelvic girdle. The large process around the neck of the bone is made up of a greater throat chanter and a lesser throat chanter. Powerful muscles involved in leg movement attached to the throat chanters. The head and the neck of the femur are especially arched to take the stress and strain of carrying weight of the body. Breaks to this region require a long time to heal because the bones have to be completely restored before it can bear the weight of the body gain again. At the distal end of the femur is a specialized articular surface that forms the knee joint with the tibia and the patella. The patella is commonly referred to as kneecap, and it is a flat triangular bone located on the front of the knee joint. It protects the front of the joint and it increases the leverage for knee joint movement. Making up the medial side of the lower leg is called the tibia. It is the larger of the lower leg bones and articulates with the fibula on its lateral side. The fibula is the thinner of the two bones and is more subject to breakage from leg injuries. At the distal ends of the bones is the process called malleosis, which articulates with the foot. And finally, we have the foot bones. The foot is composed of three groupings of bones called the tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. 7 bones make up tarsals: calcaneus, cuboid, navicular, talus, and the first, second, and third cuneiforms. The talus plays an important role in the ankle by forming the only articulation with the leg. It nestles between the distal ends of the tibia and the fibula. The calcaneus, which is the largest of the tarsals, form the heel and the part of a foot arch. Forming the middle portion of the foot are the cuboid and the navicular and the 3 cuneiform bones and 5 metatarsals. The phalanges of the foot match up in number and organization with the phalanges of the hand. If you notice in the picture here, you can see that it's kind of similar to the carpal. So yeah, they match up, and there are 2 phalanges. Instead, there are 2 phalanges instead of 3, proximal and distal. And the big toe and the 3 in each of the other toes, as they each have additional middle phalanx. The phalanges of the toes are flatter and shorter than those in the hand. So today we covered the overview of the skeletal system, and the majority of this lesson was basically the human skeletal system, where we talked about the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So if we were to review, skeletal system is composed of bones, cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. And the skeletal system is really important because it provides us with movement, protection, shape, and it also supports the body. And we talked about how there are 2 ways physicians kind of distinguish the bones, the axial and the appendicular. So the axial is the part of the skeleton composed of the spine, rib cage, and the skull, basically the vertical of our skeletal system. And the appendicular is the other one, the laterally placed bones, and it is a part of the skeleton composed of upper and lower appendages, and the bones that girdle them to the axial skeleton. And then we talked about each bones that are composed of an axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So in the axial, we have the skull, and then we also have sutures, vertebral column, rib cage, and then the appendicular skeleton, we have other appendages, the lower and upper extremities, such as the clavicle and scapula, or also known as collarbone, and the shoulder, I forgot what it's called. And then we also have the arm bones, then the hands and the wrist, then the largest bone in our body, which is the leg bones, and the foot bones. So on Wednesday, we're going to be talking about the bone types and structures, what makes them, and the joints. There are actually a lot of joints present in our body. So we're going to talk about each part of the joints and their functions. Thanks for watching, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to comment down, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.